Yes. Okay, good morning, everybody. Want to thank Adam for setting it up. Okay. Here we are on a new piece we just started. Regarding now, the Gemara is going to connect the dots between Sukkah and Shabbat. Let's see what the Gemara said. The Gemara says, Omar Rava, right? We are on Sayin Amar Aleph. We are on 7a. So 3/4 of the page down, which is going back on the quote of the Mishnah, not the quote of the Mishnah, the quote of the Gemara of having two proper walls, and the third wall even a tefah. Good morning, Max. Welcome back. Great to see you. So we said that the Brisa says that you need to have two good walls. Two good walls, which means each wall has to be, the issue of the height is not an issue. We're not discussing the height. All the walls that we're talking about are 10 tefachim high. Let's say between 3 and 4 inches. So talking about the walls between, let's say, 30 to 40 inches. Let's say, to be strict, we'll give the highest share, 40-inch walls high. But the question is, and we learned in the Gemara, there's a discussion, these walls they have to be on an angle, they have to be like an L, or is it all right if they're even parallel to each other? There's different opinions. But if you have two walls, two good walls, which means 10 high and 7 tvachim wide, a minimum of 7 tvachim wide. 7 tvachim, let's say, if you want to be strict, we'll say 4 inches to a tevach, 28 inches wide. Plus, you have a third wall, which is only a tefach wide. That would be that's a kosher sukkah, right? You learned that in the psukim, that a sukkah required how many walls? We had a machlokas. The sukkah needs 3 walls or 4 walls, but even if it needs 3 or 4 walls, the third wall or the fourth wall, that only has to be a tefach, correct? And the halacha, goes on that opinion that says that 2 walls and a tefach is good to be a kosher sukkah. It means you have 3 walls, 2 of them are a minimum of 7 tvachim wide. The third wall is a minimum of 1 tefach wide. That will be a kosher sukkah. Now, we had a lot of discussion. Adam, you want to the group that we're on? You want to send to the group that one? We had a lot of discussion exactly where do you place that third wall? Where are those 2 walls? Are those 2 walls on an L? Are those 2 walls parallel to each other? And we saw also discussion in the Gemara, besides that third wall being a tefach, you also need to create a suras pesach. You also have to make something that it looks, that also has something going across that looks like an entranceway. So that was the whole discussion, exactly where you place, and also how close to the wall, the 2 walls, do you place the tefach, the third wall. So we have a lot of discussion, exactly the details of those 3 walls. Good morning, Jaime.
Good morning, Rabbi.
So we are on 7A2 on the right side, and 7A2 in the English is on the right side. Shtayim kilchata. We said 2 walls have to be proper walls, the third wall even a tefach. Comes Amar Rava, and some change say it's Rabba, v'chein l'Shabbat. The law would work for Shabbat of Sukkot if you have this sukkah that has 2 walls, 2 proper walls, and the third wall is a tefach. That would work for Shabbat of Sukkot, that you could carry within that space. You could carry 4 amot in that space. That even though on Shabbat you're not allowed to carry in a public domain, you can't carry in a public domain. You can go 4 amot in a public domain on Shabbat. but we're going to end. But nevertheless, and usually on Shabbat, for something to be a proper to carry on Shabbat, you need 3 walls on Shabbat for Shabbat. But nevertheless, we have this halacha that this is called a kosher. This is considered a kosher wall regarding. You could use the structure on the Shabbat of Sukkot. You could use the structure on the Shabbat of Sukkot, even though it doesn't fulfill the normal on a regular Shabbat of the year. This would not work. So too, but since it works as a private domain since it works as a sukkah, it works as a dwelling place for sukkah. So too it works for Shabbat. So that's what the Gemara said. V'chein Shabbat, migli dehavi dofen linya sukkah, since it's considered a wall for sukkah, havi dofen linya Shabbat. It also works for Shabbat. Okay. Eitivei Abaye. Abaye challenges this ruling to say that if it works for Sukkah, it could work for Shabbat. Now, this the Gemara is going to identify later on that that's a very great chidush, because Shabbat is much stricter than to say something works for Shabbat. That gives and that will give you that's a stricter ruling than to say something works for Sukkah. To say something is a kosher Sukkah is it's one thing. To say something is an allowance. To say that you can fulfill the mitzvah of Sukkah with this type of Sukkah, okay, that's it's a leniency that you have 2 walls and the third wall at tefach. Good morning, Mark. So that's a good leniency.
Rabbi, the thought is that the standard for Sukkah is lower than Shabbat, but still qualifies on Shabbat. That's a very difficult thing to understand.
Right. The standard for Sukkah, what works for Sukkah would not work generally regarding Shabbat. Regarding Shabbat, that wouldn't work. But meaning if you would have 2 walls, like in an L shape, right? And then you make a third wall, you make a tefach away, you make a wall, a third wall as a tefach. That would not work. That would not make it as a private domain for Shabbat. A private domain for Shabbat would not be having an L, 1 wall here, and the third wall a tefach away. That wouldn't do it.
But that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is how does a holiday, Yom Tov, it could qualify? It supersedes Shabbat. All of a sudden, 52 weeks a year, Shabbat is at a certain level, and now we're saying we're gonna lower the standard for the holiday. Lower the standard because of the holiday.
Right, because
that kind of doesn't fit with the priority of where Shabbat is held in the Torah and everywhere else. Shabbat supersedes everything.
Right, very good. But the answer to that is because the Torah, on the Shabbat of Sukkah, the Torah says that when you have 1 wall this way, and the third wall a tefach away, we consider that third wall a wall. That's what the law because Sukkah requires 3 walls. But the halacha is you could the third wall, the wall that's a tefach, that's only 1 tefach, 1 wall this way, 1 wall this way, and then I have a third wall that's only a tefach. The Torah says that when it's Sukkah, when it's the holiday of Sukkot, that wall that's a tefach is considered a wall. It's considered a third wall. It's as if you have a third wall, 1, 2, 3. So since it's as if you have a third wall, it's the Torah calls it a wall. So once you call it a wall, so it's a wall. Good morning, Nathan. And once it's a wall, that means it's counted as a third wall. So Shabbat, to be a private domain for Shabbat, you need 3 walls. The same way Sukkah requires a minimum of 3 walls, Shabbat requires a private domain. It needs to be three walls. And now on Shabbat of Sukkah, you say this is a wall. You identify for the Sukkah. You call this Sukkah 3 walls. So therefore, if you count it in the halakha as a wall for Sukkah, comes the rabbi and says the chidush is that once it's a wall for Sukkah, it's a wall for Shabbat as well.
Rabbi, I love you, but you're not answering the question.
I am answering the question because we're saying
here's how I would imagine the question to be phrased, or maybe the way I don't want to say the way the rabbi should look at it because that's maybe going too far. But if why isn't Shabbat leading the conversation? Why isn't Shabbat to say, if you need 3 walls that are a such size on Shabbat, that has to be that you're going to have a Shabbat on Sukkot. So because you need 3 walls this size on Shabbat, then you better make sure on Sukkot you have walls that are these 3 this size.
So we're saying, how is the standard lowered from Shabbat, which we hold usually higher than anything, for Sukkot?
Right. So we're saying
Shabbat should be. They should be thinking about it or talking, or there should be a question of, if you're going to have a Shabbat, which you always have a Shabbat on Sukkot, you're going to have a Shabbat on Sukkot, make sure your 3 walls are X size, or the requirement for Shabbat, so that you cover it on Shabbat, and that also would cover you on Sukkot. Like you would cover 2 birds with 1 stone.
Very good. So the answer is, we have something we have a law that we established in the Gemara earlier that says there's halakha l'Moshe Misinai, that the 3rd wall by Sukkah, this is the fact. Good morning, Ariel. That when it comes to Sukkah, the given fact by Sukkah is 2 walls, and there's 2 given facts. What's the facts on the ground? Number 1, Sukkah requires 3 walls. Fact number 1. We learned Sukkim. Remember, we had all Gemara, Sukkot, the way it's read, the way it's written. There's biblical teachings that a Sukkah requires 3 walls. That's a biblical law. There's another law that's a Torah law from Halacha Moshe Sinai, that a Sukkah, the 3rd wall, can be a tefach. That's another law that we find given. That's a fact that's given by Sukkah.
But what's the standard for Shabbat?
Right. So that's the great. This is the great chidush of Rabbah. Rabbah comes to the table, and his contribution is, he tells us that even though Shabbat we know is very, very strict, but once the Torah counts this as a biblical wall, the Torah calls this, when it comes to the Shabbat of Sukkah, the Torah says that this wall, this 3rd wall, which is a tefach, is called, meets the biblical requirements of a 3rd wall. It's
but
a 3rd
not
wall.
On a regular Shabbat?
On a regular Shabbat, it's not. We don't count it as a third wall. Correct.
So we are using a lower standard on Sukkot Shabbat than on a regular Shabbat.
Correct. Exactly. That's
hard to digest.
Okay, but why is it good? I understand it's hard to digest. That's a novelty. But what's the reason for it? What's the rationale? How does he come up? How does he know this idea?
But he has a source in the Torah, you're saying.
Right. He has a Torah source that says that on Shabbat of Sukkah, this is considered a wall. The Torah counts this 3rd wall as a wall that you could go ahead and use. You fulfill the requirements of a wall. There's a wall that's needed. There's a 3rd wall that's needed for a Sukkah. And the Torah says this identifies this structure as having 3 walls. Right? The Torah says if you make a sukkah, you have a sukkah, come Shabbat of sukkah, Shabbat of sukkah, there are 3 walls here. Right? We'll finish this point.
But on a regular Shabbat, this doesn't qualify as a private
regular
domain.
Shabbat, it does not, right? The Torah does not call, on a regular Shabbat, the Torah does not identify this structure as 3 walls. But on the Shabbat of Sukkah, the Torah labels this structure has 3 walls. So if the
Based
Torah
on what
says,
pasuk? What's the proof for that?
we said the proof that we had Sukkim taught us that you need 3 walls for Shabbat. And then there was a halacha on Moshe Missinai that says that one of those 3 walls could be a tefach. It doesn't have to be
only on Sukkot, but not on regular Shabbat.
Right. It does not.
Why can't we use that? Why can't we use that pasuk for all Shabbats?
Because that was a special law that was given by, it was that law that is considered a wall, was given by the mitzvah of Sukkah. Now it was given by the mitzvah of Sukkah that's called a wall. It wasn't.
Why
given
can't we
by
use that for Shabbat? Why can't we apply that?
Because the fact that the Torah gave that leniency for Sukkah doesn't mean that it's considered a wall on Sukkot. Doesn't mean that the Torah is going to say that that doesn't mean that law for Sukkah would apply to a regular Shabbat. But
So
if
it's only a wall on Sukkot, but not on the rest of the year.
Right, it's just like matzah. Matzah, the rest of the year you make a mezonot, the Sfardim.
Mhm.
On the holiday of Pesach, what do you say on the matzah? Hamotzi. That's the bread. That's the bread of that's called the bread for Pesach. So this is the bread. That's the bread of the holiday, and so therefore, but once you identify, if I ask you about this structure today on Shabbat of Sukkah, I come over to you on Shabbat of Sukkah, and I say to you, you call this, you consider this today. The only time we found that you're going to consider it 3 walls. Today you're calling this 3 walls. Today in Shabbat of Sukkah, you're calling it 3 walls. You're identifying as a 3rd wall. So therefore, the same day that you're identifying today that you use this as a wall, today we're going to say that's a wall. The same way you're using this is a wall today. So you're going to say it's a wall today. Today it's a wall for Sukkah, but it's not a wall today for Shabbat. So he says no. Today it's considered a wall for Sukkah. He says today it's considered a wall for Shabbat as well. That is his novelty. Yes.
Is there a general term for when one standard supersedes another? Like tadir v'she'eno tadir kodem. Is there a term for this lowering of the standard?
I mean, generally something that's more boss, something, you can't learn out something that's more strict from something that's more light. In general, there's a kula and the chumrah. Right. But here in this case,
that's what I was looking for.
Right. That this is his chidush. And by the way,
but let me ask this.
What'd you say?
Ask this?
Yes.
Is it? We don't hold like this, do we?
We do hold like this. They're going to see.
We do hold that the
on the Shabbat of Sukkah. On the Shabbat of Sukkah.
Right. The 3rd wall only needs to be a tefach. We hold that, or it needs to be a little bigger.
Yes, but we hold about that. But remember, we had a lot of other discussion besides having a tefach on the 3rd wall. The Gemara also discussed the need for a surata pesach in addition to that tefach. Remember, we had that another opinion in the Gemara besides having that
with the overhead bar, with overhead bar,
and
right. So now those descriptions with the overhead bar and the other panel, etc., does that fit the needs for Shabbat?
Right. So there is. That's a good question. Whether here also you would need, this halacha that the Gemara says v'chein l'Shabbat. So again, Mark, there's this, whatever would be required by Sukkah would be required by Shabbat. Whatever the standard you're going to make for Sukkah should be for Shabbat will be on that Shabbat. If you require that through the Pesach, you would require that for Sukkah too. Whatever for Shabbat also. Whatever you would require for Sukkah, there's the minimal, there are different opinions what it requires for Sukkah. But a tefach wall. On a regular Shabbat, that would not make it a private domain that you would be able to carry. What the difference is that here because Shabbat would need 3 walls. You need a wall. You need a third wall to make something a private domain. Make something a private domain. No private domain. No, you don't need 4 amot, but you have 3 walls. And has to have at least, let's say, 4 tvachim 4 tvachim inside for Shabbat. Be a private domain for Shabbat to carry. Meaning the area inside, 4 tvachim inside this area to be a private domain. But this idea of Ariel, you want to ask something else? So I'm saying the Gemara just says whatever you told me meets the requirement for Sukkah, on Shabbat of Sukkah, we're going to use that. If it's called a wall, if it's called a Max, is it clear? Max, is it clear? Nathan, is it clear? If it's called a wall for Sukkah, it meets the requirements of a third wall. What do they both have in common? They both have in common, Shabbat and Sukkah, is that Sukkah requires 3 walls. Halachically, there needs to be, you have to meet the legal, we have a lawyer in the room, the legal requirements of 3 walls, and you need the legal requirements of a Sukkah, of Shabbat, to be a private domain. You have to have 3 walls. Now, everybody got to be careful. They have a lawyer in the room. Yeah, you have, be careful what you say. But you require 3 walls. That's the, okay. So we need 3 walls on Shabbat to be fitted. It has to be 10 tvachim high, and it has to be, let's say, 4 tvachim wide, a certain width of the wall for Shabbat to be a wall. But we're focusing on there's 3. If you have 2 walls on Shabbat, if you have 2 walls like this going on adjacent this way, and a third wall a tefach away, that doesn't work on a regular Shabbat. That's not called a private domain. You only enclose on 2 sides this way. And the third side, one side you're completely open, and another side you only have 1 tefach of a wall. So that's not considered a private domain on a regular Shabbat. You can't say I'm gonna carry stuff with it. If you go in a public street and you put up 2 walls like this, and the third wall you make a tefach on a regular Shabbat, now you're gonna say this is a private domain? It's still public domain. But since on Sukkah, on Sukkah you could sleep in this Sukkah. This place you put up a wall here in the street, a wall here in the street, and a third wall at tefach, and you ran schachal across it. You say you could. That's called 3 walls today. Today we're gonna label you. You get a check. You met the requirements of 3 walls. So the chidush is if the Torah considers this a wall today on the Shabbat of Sukkah, the Torah calls this thing a wall. You can therefore, if it's a wall, so therefore it's considered 3 walls. Now the Torah calls it 3 walls, so therefore you can carry in it because it's like you have 3 walls. And that's called a dwelling. Yes. But it's true. But it needs to be considered a wall, and that's the chidush. Everybody, Mark and Jaime are grappling with this chidush, that this novelty that we're going to say we consider. The Torah calls it a wall on the Shabbat of Sukkah. For a Sukkah, we're going to say it's also called a wall. We're not going to say it's a wall for this, but it's not a wall for that. That's what he wants to. Even though Jaime's saying very good. Maybe you could say no. Maybe the standard for Sukkah is lower than the standard of, that's Jaime's question. lower than the standard of Shabbat. For Sukkah, we could call it a wall, but for Shabbat, we're not going to call it a wall. But that's what he said. He says he doesn't want to make that distinction. He's telling us there's no distinction.
Rabbi, can you think of any other place in the Torah where the standard for Shabbat is lowered for any other holiday?
See, the way I'm looking at it, Jaime, we're looking at it, it's not a question of being lowered. It's a question, do we identify it? Is it called, how do we look at this thing? Is it called a wall or not? Once it's a wall, this rabbi understands that it's a wall all, across the board.
It's not a wall the rest of the year. So for the purposes of Shabbat, it doesn't qualify. Only on this day does it qualify as a wall.
Right. Because this day the Torah gave it the status.
If you think throughout the year, the laws of Shabbat supersede every other law on that day. I can't think of one where there's an exception where Shabbat is lowered down or made easier to accommodate for a Chag. Can you?
Right, but no, we don't. Yeah, we don't find that. It's true, but the question also is once we say it's a wall. By the way, here's another. I'm going to answer your question.
It's only a wall on that day.
Right, but also it could also work. It could also work as a stringency by making it a wall. It's not only by counting it as a wall for Shabbat. It's not only making a leniency. It also will serve as a stringency. How? Because it's true that if we count this as a wall, so we have 3 walls and this becomes a private domain. And because it's a private domain, you could walk more than 4 amot, carry something in a private domain. In a private domain, you could carry 4 amot, you could carry in a private domain. But also it would serve as in a strict way, Jaime. How would it serve in a strict way? If on Shabbat, if someone's in a public property, and he walked and he carried something he went one step, he went 1 amah, he went, let's say, 2 feet, 1.5 feet, and he carried something. He didn't violate biblical law by carrying something. If a guy picked up something in the street on Shabbat, and he went ahead, good morning, Michael, good morning, Yosef. A guy on Shabbat picks up something in the street, and then he went 1
Morning,
step.
Rabbi.
Good morning. He picked it up between 1 step. He didn't violate biblical law, right? He didn't violate biblical law. He shouldn't be carrying any amount in the street, but he didn't violate biblical law because he didn't go 4 amot. But what happens, Jaime, if this guy he's one step outside this structure on Shabbat of Sukkah, and he picks up something 1 step in the street outside the structure, and he walks 1 step into this area. Now he went from public domain to private domain, and he violated the Torah. So it's not only serving in a leniency way, it's also going to create a stringency for Shabbat too. So maybe that could make you feel answer your question a little better. It's not a one-way street. It's not just with just being lenient for Shabbat. It's going to also create a stringency for Shabbat in that aspect. So maybe that's why the rabbi holds that you can compare the two, because we're not just taking a law that applies here and applying it to a Shabbat, which is generally stricter, but we're creating a stringency for Shabbat as well. Mark, you hear that idea? So therefore, Mark, I think, buys it. We've got a sale on the deal. So it's sold. So Nathan says it's sold. So that maybe that could be a little bit of his why he could buy it. Now, if you look at the Rashi, I just read you the first 2 lines of the Rashi. V'chein l'Shabbat. It's on the wide lines of the page. You have v'chein l'Shabbat. The Rashi says v'chein l'Shabbat. Everyone have it? It's the first line of the wide lines of the Gemara. V'chein l'Shabbat. Got it? V'chein l'Shabbat. Af al pi shesorach l'Shabbat. Even though Shabbat requires 3 mechitzot, 3 partitions, leosod reshut hayachid, to be considered a private area. But Shabbat shel Sukkot, the Shabbat of Sukkah, mutar, it is permitted lismoch, to rely on mechitzot hasukkah, to rely on the petitions of the sukkah. Im asa birshut rabim. If you created in the public domain, samuch lepitcho, right next to your entranceway of your house was right next to flush with the public property. If you made in that public property right outside your doorway, sukkah, a sukkah, the ein ba, and that sukkah only has elashtayim kilchatam. That sukkah has only two proper walls, going this way. Ushlishit, and the third wall, afilu tefach. The third wall of this structure, Boaz, that you made right in front of you, and a tefach. You have two good walls, one third wall tefach. Machnis. No, third wall is a tefach. You have two walls and a third wall tefach. Machnis umotzi. Hey, mena, you could go and bring from here, from your house to that structure that's right outside your door, and from that structure into your house. You're not going from private to public or public to private, because that structure is considered private property. And you're going from your house, which is private property, into private property. So you're good to go. That's the, Max, is that clear? Even though on a regular Shabbat of the year, if I would go ahead and create a structure in front of my doorway that has two walls and the third wall at tefach, I can't go carry from inside my house, inside this structure, or from the structure in the house, because that structure has the status of public domain. It's not private. But here, if you go into the next line, Rashi says, or Inami, Bisham Bechitzol She'ino Shel Sukkah Lo Mishteri. But the Shabbat is Sukkah. Shabbat of Sukkah, Sharia. I could use this on Shabbat of Sukkah. Why? I could carry from my house into here. Why? Migui Tahu Tefach Agmer Rachmana LeMoshe. That third wall, Hashem told Moshe, B'mechitzot Sukkah, that when it comes to a partition of a sukkah, the lahavile dofen shleima l'sukkah, that's considered, we legally consider it a full wall, even though it's not a full wall. It meets the requirements of a wall. Tahavi dofen nami l'shabbat the sukkah. So on Shabbat of Sukkah, it's also considered a wall in your Shabbat. That's how Rashi explains the Gemara. So now we're going to see Abaye doesn't buy it so fast. Abaye is not so, he's challenging. He's going to challenge this chidush. He's going to challenge it, but not all challenge. Some people meet the challenge, right? He's going to meet the Gemara is going to meet the challenge. Abaye. Abaye says, "Is that true? Do we say umiya minan migui? Do we say such a thing? Do we say that if the fact that it's good, it meets the requirement for the wall of Sukkah, it meets the requirement for the wall of Shabbat?" Jaime's question, Mark's question, is that true that we will say such a thing? That's going to be this challenge. Let's see what his challenge is. He says, Vatanya, we have a breita. Got everybody, you're getting me going over here. You're getting me fired up today, right? Nathan, am I on fire or not? Am I on fire?
Rabbi, tell them to get a hose.
Michael said we got to get a hose. What did you say? Yeah, but now we're back to the Gemara. The Gemara says, back to the Gemara. In the Art Scroll, we are back in the Gemara we're on 7, 8. Now we just turned the page. 7A3. Abaye. Abaye challenges this. Mi or mina migui. Do we say migui? Vatanya, we have a breita. Dofen shel sukkah, dofen shel Shabbat. The wall of a sukkah is, we look at Shabbat as an example to teach us regarding the wall of a sukkah. That means just in what way on Shabbat you could go ahead and create a wall with thin sticks, thin poles with spaces in between, even though it's not flush with each other. They're not next to each other like this. There's spaces, as long as these poles are, or these poles are less than 3 tfachim away from each other, less within, let's say 9 inches of each other, 11 inches of each other. If you don't have a gap more than 3 tfachim within, let's say 9 or so inches, it's considered, as we legally, halachically, it's considered as if it's together. We don't look at a gap. If it's a gap that, right, Michael, a gap that's less than 3 tefachim is lavud. We consider it's joined together. So the same way for Shabbat, you consider this a wall. A stick here, and with space, but it's considered a wall for Shabbat. That's also considered a wall for Sukkah. You might have dropped the paper. If you make a Sukkah, if you make a wall of a Sukkah, like that type of fashion, it's considered you made a wall. That's called the wall of a Sukkah, as long as you don't have, as long as between one stick, one pole and the next pole, you don't have a space of 3 tfachim, of 9 inches. Now, v'yatera Shabbat al Sukkah, but there's a stringency of Shabbat over Sukkah. Now, what is the stringency of Shabbat al Sukkah? That Shabbat ain't an iteret, ela be'omeid meruba ala parutz. On Shabbat, for something to be considered a wall, you need to have more wall than openings. If you have cuts in the wall, and if you add up the cuts in the wall, the empty space is more than the size of the standing spaces of the wall. That's not a wall, but it's considered breached. It's broken. The wall is broken. If you have 51% of the wall is intact, and you have 49% empty space, that's considered a wall. But if you have if you have more space than structure that's filled, that's not a wall. However, Masha'e came to Sukkah. On Sukkah, even though you have a Sukkah that there's more empty space in the walls than filling, it's good, right? We know by Sukkah, the third wall is only a tefach, right? We have a third wall that's only a tefach. The whole fourth wall is totally open. The third wall is tefach, and then there could be openings in the other 2 walls. There could be a certain amount of openings, and yet it's considered kosher by Sukkah. So you have a Sukkah has a leniency that we don't have on Shabbat. For Shabbat, you can have something which is a wall, which is not considered a wall for Shabbat. For example, like we were saying, all year round, if you have 2 walls on Shabbat and the third wall is a tefach, it doesn't work. It's not considered a wall. But for Sukkah, the third wall is tefach, even though the third wall it's 90% open, but the fact that you have a wall that's a tefach, it's good enough. So we see by Shabbat we're more strict. We consider a wall. It's not considered a wall for Shabbat, but it's considered a wall for Sukkah. Okay. Now, my love, so the Gemara is thinking, Yetera Shabbat the Sukkah, Sukkah. Most probably he means the Shabbat, we'll see tomorrow, I don't want to be late to davening. We'll see tomorrow what the challenge of Abaya is, how he presents the challenge. Have a great day, everybody. We don't want people to be late. A beautiful, beautiful Gemara, everybody. All Gemaras are beautiful. But what makes it beautiful is when people are involved, when people ask, when people talk up. That's what I like to hear. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you,
Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you. Yosef, good to see you as well. Have a great day, everybody.
Likewise.
Here, Michael. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Welcome. Bye-bye. Okay, we'll look forward to seeing everyone back, hopefully